My name is Jerry Smith. Welcome to Arts Alive Books. Joining me tonight is academic, poet and radio producer Seán Street. He's going to be talking to us about two of his books, The Poetry of Radio and also The Memory of Sound. Coming up later in the show, we profile Ian Sinclair. But first tonight, Seán Street. Welcome, Seán.
Thank you.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you developed this cluster of interests that you have in sound and memory and radio and poetry?
Right, well, I've worked as a radio producer and worked as a presenter and in radio, all things radio, I suppose, for about 44 years, a long time, and mostly working on documentaries and features. And parallel with that, I've worked as a writer, as a poet, and I began to see increasingly that there were connections between sound and poetry, which we can talk about maybe in a moment. But towards about halfway through that period of time, I began working as an academic and exploring the idea of sound in a radio context from a more theoretical point of view.
Mm. I mean, sound in radio, it's got a very specific, the people trained to reproduce good sound and sound effects and so on, but you mean it in a slightly different way, don't you?
Yes, I do, and I think that to bring this whole idea of sound and poetry together, one almost needs to go back to the origins of poetry itself, where poetry was, before it was print on page, it was sound and language, and print, if you like, hijacks that, and radio has the capacity to give us back the orality of poetry. But I mean more than that too, because I mean that radio is a poetic medium. Sound itself is a kind of poetry. There's a motif I use in the book, The Poetry of Radio, of the bell. And the bell, to me, is an absolutely wonderful metaphor for the movement between the physical and the imaginative worlds. You strike a bell, it's an act of violence, if you like. You're striking something with an extreme physicality, and gradually the bell disappears into silence. But where is that silence? Where does that silence begin? Mm-hmm. That's where the imaginative world takes us, really, and that's why I think the bell is a good example of that. Sound, pure sound, is a poetic thing in that sense. So is silence. I mean, you could argue that silence itself is sound in an active way. Perhaps it's no coincidence. It must be a coincidence, but it feels like it's a divine one to have the word silent as an anagram of listen. Mm-hmm. For me, there is a poetic nature in sound itself, and I think it's something that was perceived in the very early days of radio, the development of this extraordinary medium that passes through storms, that passes through walls, that is invisible. You look at the early broadcasters, Reith and Arthur Burrows and people like that, who were at the beginnings of the BBC, and you begin to see that for them it was, of course, they got the technology, they understood the technology, but there was still something mystical about it. And it's interesting that when they opened the Daventry transmitter, which was the first national radio transmitter in the country, on Borough Hill in Northamptonshire, more or less the geographical centre of Britain, England, it was built on a Danish burial ground, a Viking burial ground. And the Vikings believed that they would plant a tree at the centre of their burial grounds, where the roots would absorb the spirits of the dead and the branches would transmit the spirits to the afterlife. Now, what better metaphor do you want for a transmitter? So they actually, when they opened that transmitter, they employed the poet Alfred Noyes to write a poem called The Danetree. I'll just read a couple of lines from it, sure. Because the Danetree was about that idea. This was a gift to a poet. The idea that this new tree is transmitting spirits through the air. Daventry calling, memory, love, the graves beneath and the stars above. Even in my laughter you shall hear the power to whom the far is near. All are in one circle bound, and all that ever was lost is found.
This is closely tied up also with the category of memory for you, isn't it?
Well, when I finished writing the poetry of radio, I thought, well, I've said what I want to say there. I've pulled these two disciplines together. And then I realized increasingly that there was something more to be said. And the other aspect of that is about memory. The idea of sound as a memory, the evocation of memory through a sound. It might be music, it might be a radio program you heard as a child, it might be something like that. But yes, I started to think more and more about how memory is linked to sound. And as we grow older, this becomes more and more important for us, I think. Sounds disappear back into the past. It might be the sound for, a London commuter of a route master bus or something like that, something quite mundane. Mm-hmm. Or even the sound of a dial-up modem. I mean, remember those? They're already in the past, and yet
so last century.
But when you hear that, it's Proust and the idea of involuntary memory. Something can jolt you.
Yeah.
And that's very potent. And I think this is actually something really quite important. I believe it takes us into an area, as we grow older, as memories fade, that the use of sound as a trigger to regain the self is going to become more and more important.
Now, you're a critic and a theorist and an academic, but you're also a poet. And I think you're going to read this poem now in which you try to pull some of these concerns together.
Yes, well, while I was writing The Memory of Sound, this whole idea of memory and loss of it might be through Alzheimer's, it might be through dementia or whatever, became very personal because my father-in-law became ill. He was growing quite old. He went into a care home. And I wrote this poem called A Different Door. On one occasion, my wife went to visit him, and he said, I always look at the door and wait for you to come through it. But I always look at that door and then pointed at the wall, because that's where my wife comes through. His wife had passed away some years ago. So this poem comes out of that experience. He was always staring at the wall when we came visiting, as if waiting for something else to happen. Intent he was, spoke of the other door he was watching. So he diagnosed between us how he'd begun to misunderstand the mix of it, the voices that confuse thinking. There's wind in trees, but it's a waterfall. That's how non sequiturs sing. There's a gutter outside sobbing in the rain. When does weather change, dark begin? When did that laugh turn to a cry? When's silence? So much white noise. But somewhere there was whispered singing, a moment caught between signals, between tectonic plates, crash, stillness amongst the thunder of dying. A crack in the brain, unlocking two notes like sweet gunshots. Listen, the ghost of a guitar, just two notes, silver, gold. You and I, if only we had been sound. You and I, as we were, before the cacophony tangled us. The original, simple sound. He waited each day, watched for visitors. At first the room stayed empty. He barely noticed the rest of us. Then one by one, sister, brother, father, mother, finally the most missed, came through another door. He's confused, they said, but it was their confusion. Actually, it was sharp, clear, two sweet gunshots to the brain. Honesty's all in the mind. The beginning of an end is always ambiguous, but the end of an end never is. He and she, the two of them moving invisibly past us, watch as we might, through a doorway in a nearby wall.
So, images of memory and sound.
Yes, I mean, that poem comes from a collection called Cello, which in itself is about sound, of course, is inherent in the title. But it also, I think, demonstrates my own preoccupation at the time with sound and memory, as evinced in books like The Poetry of Radio and The Memory of Sound, which are intimately connected for me with the whole essence of poetry.
Seán Street, for the moment, thank you very much. Welcome back. The Bluecoats' annual celebration of Malcolm Lowry, the Merseyside-born author of the cult novel Under the Volcano, took place recently. The Lowry Lounge 2014 featured Ian Sinclair talking about Lowry in relation to his 2013 book, American Smoke.
This afternoon we're pleased to welcome Ian Sinclair to the Lowry Lounge. Ian is one of Britain's most acclaimed but independent-minded authors, a poet since the 1970s. After a period as a bookseller, an important fact, he became a novelist. And Whitechapel Scarlet Tracings traces the bloody trail of the Ripper murders and the even bloodier and occult trade of book dealing. Ladies and gentlemen, Ian Sinclair.
Thank you. This, is a particular privilege to be here. And so I'm going to start with a quote from Luna Caustic. And the quote says, "Again the pilgrimage starts, but his course is so erratic, he seems to be looking for rather than trying to remember something." And I think that's it, this erratic pilgrimage. Searching for memories of fictional guidebooks that lay on top of the membrane of deeper memories and coincidences and accidents. And all of my writing has been about that, which is simply, in a lot of ways, just putting yourself into the position where these things will happen. So you have these things that you could call them coincidences, recognitions, correspondences, Swedenborgian moments that seem to reflect the kind of state of mind that the fugue that someone like Lowry gets into. So when I came to do the book American Smoke, which was really about that, it was about the fact that my influences and the people who gripped me, apart from Lowry himself, were generally American or European rather than English at that time. So the moment actually came late on, when I started to journey to the places where these figures had been, or recall earlier trip when I met people like William Burroughs in Lawrence, Kansas, and Gregory Corso in New York, and put together the backstory and a sense of the present, looking at these places as they are now, and seeing if my ideas of what the writers had been had changed. With Olson, you get a very strong sense of something that's close to Lowry in the idea of the Conradian and the Melvillian and the world voyage, again as a sort of Homeric entity. And then I came back to England to try and sort of begin to make sense of all this. And it was only then that it dawned on me that because I was down in St Leonard's near Hastings, that in fact Lowry was, after this huge epic journey, his book was buried just down the road in the village of Ripe. And so out of nowhere we decided that off we go to Ripe to try and make some connection with that. And I'll just read a little of that. Right. "We were spending more time, as much as possible, on the south coast, a flat in St Leonard's-on-Sea, attempting to evaluate boxes and files of hopelessly disconnected research material from journeys made in the wake of other journeys. The self-consciously quaint hill town of Rye, with cobbles and tea shops and silted harbour, had its overloud cultural associations. From Henry James and the early modernists to E.F. Benson and the two Pauls, Nash and McCartney. The author of Under the Volcano was boxed at earth on my doorstep in the village of Ripe. The thing you are searching for is within touching distance, but you're obliged to cross oceans, witness forest fires, take open-top bus tours around the Hollywood Hills before you're allowed to contemplate the names and dates on a local headstone box. Thank you.
Seán Street joins us again to talk about one of his favourite poems, Robert Frost's Iris by Night, written in memory of Edward Thomas. And Seán has kindly agreed to read the poem.
Right. Yes, this is a memory of a walk that Frost and Thomas took on the Malverns in August 1914. And it was written after the death of Edward Thomas. Iris by Night. One misty evening, one another's guide, we two were groping down a Malvern side, the last wet fields and dripping hedges home. There came a moment of confusing lights, such as according to belief in Rome were seen of old at Memphis on the heights, before the fragments of a former sun could concentrate anew and rise as one. Light was a paste of pigment in our eyes. And then there was a moon, and then a scene so watery as to seem submarine, in which we two stood, saturated, drowned. The clover mingled rowan on the ground had taken all the water it could as dew, and still the air was saturated too, its airy pressure turned to water weight. Then a small rainbow, like a trellis gate, a very small moon-made prismatic bow, stood closely over us through which to go. And then we were vouchsafed the miracle that never yet to other two befell, and I alone of us have lived to tell. A wonder, bow and rainbow as it bent, instead of moving with us as we went to keep the pots of gold from being found, it lifted from its dewy pediment its two mote-swimming many-coloured ends and gathered them together in a ring. And we stood in it, softly circled round. From all division, time or foe can bring, in a relation of elected friends.
Powerful stuff. From just over 100 years ago.
Almost exactly 100 years ago, yeah.
What is it that speaks to you in the poem?
Well, in a way, Frost links to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the memory of sound and the poetry of sound through Frost's own theories of the sound of sense in his poetry, the idea that language and the sound of the voice uttering it has a quality almost independent of the words themselves. So you almost don't need to know what the words are saying to interpret what's being said or the mood of what's being said. So I talk about Frost in the books we were discussing earlier. The other aspect of that, I suppose, is a book I wrote some years ago, which has just been republished by Seán, called The Poetry, called The Memory of, called The Dimmock Poets, I beg your pardon, The Dimmock Poets, Poetry, Place and Memory. There's memory again coming into the conversation. And in that book, I explored the friendship that developed around the Gloucestershire village of Dimmock, in which Frost and Thomas came together and had that famous walk. And I just think it's a very moving poem. Frost wrote a lot of poetry from that time. He was living in Britain from 1912 to 1915, met Edward Thomas, who was a critic, not a poet at that point, but Thomas was very instrumental through his reviews of Frost's work in launching Frost, particularly back in the States, through A Boy's Will and North of Boston, which were the two books that were published during that time. For his own part, Frost triggered the idea of poetry in Edward Thomas. Edward Thomas had written a lot of prose, he'd not written any poetry. By the end of that Malvern year, he'd begun to write poetry. So for me, it's a pivotal poem for both those men.
It's a funny period, isn't it? I mean, it hasn't done particularly well in literary history, that period of English poetry, but something like this could have helped us to see again the power of the people working then.
I think the Georgians got a bad press, and particularly because of what happened next, the war, and then modernism, and so forth. And I do think that the Dimmock poets, if we talk about the Dimmock poets as a group, were of a very variable quality. We're talking about Wilfred Gibson, Lascelles Abercrombie, John Drinkwater, Rupert Brooke was part of it, and then Frost and Thomas coming into that mix. So in a sense, I sort of feel that there were two Dimmock groups, and Frost and Thomas are quite separate to the others, and those significantly perhaps are the voices that we see as being influential through the 20th century subsequently.
Yeah. Incredibly poignant about Thomas and that whole generation in some respects.
Yes, I knew Thomas's daughter, Mavanwi, very well, and the book, The Dimmock Poets, is dedicated to her memory. And the ideas that develop between those two, I think in a sense, another of the poems from that period, from Thomas's side, is The Sun Used to Shine. The sun used to shine while we two walked, paused, talked and walked on again. It's almost a companion piece to Iris by Night from Thomas's point of view. And those walks were, I think, literary workshops between the two of them, really.
Seán Street, thanks very much for joining us and for telling us about your favourite poem. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and we'll see you on the next edition of Arts Alive Books.